Hi, I'm Amina Khan, a research officer at the Growth, Poverty and Equality Program at ODI. So my question is to Dr. Ebadi, and I'd like to hear your thoughts as well from UN Women. One of the things I caught on was the idea of intervening and sort of changing mindsets of men and boys. I think one of the things that I take away from all of this is beyond action on more global levels. There's something that needs to change individually. And what are your thoughts then on building progressive husbands, brothers, and fathers? Because we can have high quality education, but what happens when our fathers don't send us to school or prefer to send our brothers over us? And the second thing then is what happens when we base all of this on sheer difference and ideologies?
Thank you. And then, sorry, could I see those hands again? There's a woman here, and then in the front here, and then over there, trying to spread across the room. Yes, please. Oh, sorry, you go first, and then we'll hand it over there. Yeah.
Elizabeth Blunt, Iran News. The question everyone's asking seems to be, what can we do? I would like to ask Dr. Shirin if she thinks that the sort of people and organisations represented here have been too timid, too reticent about not imposing their own values on other people. And I'd like to ask BC if the solutions of education and bombing them with books and knowledge is actually applicable in Nigeria, where you've got such an anti-intellectual movement in Boko Haram.
Thank you.
Thank you. Heather Barr from Human Rights Watch. This is a question mostly for Ms. Puri, but for other panelists as well. My perspective is maybe a bit cynical because it's mostly from looking at Afghanistan, but 1325 doesn't look very successful from that perspective, both in terms of governments themselves and in terms of donor governments who seem perfectly willing to ignore participation of women. So I was curious about what opportunities there are related to the October 22nd, 15th anniversary of 1325 to try and add some teeth to the implementation of that resolution.
Thank you very much. And then over here.
Hello, my name's Rosie Pepin-Vorman, and I'm at the UCL Institute of Education. My question's largely for Ms. Puri, but I'm interested in anyone else's responses too. We're currently seeing a change in global power balance and the emergence of economies like the growth of economies in India, China, and Brazil. And these governments will come to play a more important role in the post-2015 agenda. They may have particular approaches to gender rights and are beginning bilateral aid programs. And they also have strong women's movements, which may have particular approaches to gender equality. What do you feel are the implications, especially in terms of the global social mobilization that you were talking about?
Thank you. I thought you all amazingly succinct there. Thank you very much. So a lot of that is heading your way, Ms. Puri, but I'll give you a moment to think about that as we turn to Dr. Ebadi and look at those issues about fathers and brothers, and are we too timid about imposing our values?
باید بگم که هر مرد زورگویی به هر حال در دامن یک زن تربیت شده.
First of all, I would like to say that every man who is a bully has been raised by a woman.
و من وقتی که در قسمت اول صحبت هم گفتم منظورم از فرهنگ پدرسالار جنس مذکر نیست، یعنی همین.
And when I said in my speech that by patriarchal culture, I'm not just referring to the male, that's what I meant.
زنان هرچند قربانیان این فرهنگ غلط هستند، اما متاسفانه انتقال دهنده این فرهنگ هم هستند.
While we acknowledge that women are victims of this wrong patriarchal culture, but unfortunately they also transmit this culture as well.
فرهنگ پدرسالار رو من به بیماری هموفیلی تشبیه میکنم.
I always try and draw parallels between patriarchal culture and hemophilia.
هموفیلیا یک بیماری ژنتیکیه که یک زخم کوچک میتونه خونریزی زیادی بده.
Now, hemophilia is a genetic blood disorder, and a small prick could actually lead to heavy bleeding.
این ژن بیمار همیشه از مادر از طریق مادر منتقل میشه.
And this gene is always transferred from the mother to the child.
اما جالبه که مادری که این ژن بیمار رو داره پسرش بیمار میشه نه دخترش.
But what's interesting is that although the mother is carrying this gene, is her son that actually suffers from hemophilia, not the daughter.
فرهنگ پدرسالار هم اینطور عمل میکنه.
And this is exactly how a patriarchal culture works.
به همین دلیلی که من این همه به آموزش دختران اهمیت میدم.
Which is why I constantly emphasize on the education of girls.
به همین دلیلی که میگم زنها بایستی مذهب خودشون رو یاد بگیرن و خودشون کتابای مقدس رو تفسیر کنن.
Which is why I always say women have to learn about their religion themselves and teach their religion and interpret it themselves.
برای اینکه تا زنها اون طرز تفکر رو با این فرهنگ آشنا نشن، باهاش مبارزه نکنن، هیچ تغییری در پسراشون اتفاق نخواهد افتاد.
Because as long as women do not have the knowledge themselves, they're not going to change their mentality, they're not going to change that culture, and their sons are not going to change.
اما آیا ما واقعا میتونیم سر هر یعنی با ریختن کتاب بر سر مردم همه چی عوض میشه؟
Now, can we indeed change everything by throwing books at people?
من این در حقیقت یک تشبیه بود، یک مثال بود که من زدم، ولی با این مثال میخواستم چیز بزرگتری رو بیان کنم.
This was just an example that I gave you, but by giving that example, I wanted to mention something that's more important.
و میخواستم بگم که با خشونت و جنگ هیچی عوض نمیشه.
I want to say that with violence and war, nothing can be changed.
ما فقط با از طریق آموزش میتوانیم این نوع فرهنگ ها رو عوض کنیم.
We can only transform these cultures and norms by way of education.
بعد از اینکه 11 سپتامبر اتفاق افتاد، آمریکا به افغانستان حمله کرد و از اون موقع به این طرف خیلی از تروریست‌ها کشته شدن.
After 9/11, America attacked Afghanistan and many terrorists were killed.
اما متاسفانه تعداد تروریست‌ها روز به روز بیشتر شد، حتی الان داعش هم آیسیس هم در حقیقت از همون گروه آمده بیرون.
But nevertheless, the number of terrorists seem to be growing even more, and now ISIS or Islamic State has been added.
حالا فکر کنید که اگر به یاد و با نام 4000 نفری که در فاجعه 11 سپتامبر کشته شده بودند، آمریکا 4000 مدرسه در افغانستان ساخته بود.
Now imagine if the United States had, in the name or in the memory of the 4,000 people who were killed in 9/11, had built 4,000 schools in these countries, in Afghanistan.
چه اتفاقی می‌افتاد؟
What do you think it would have happened?
اون بچه‌ای که تو مدرسه درس خونده بود که به اسم جورجه و یادش میموند هر روز که میرفت سر کلاس یادش بود که پدر من باعث کشته شدن جورج شد، اما من دارم تو همین مدرسه درس میخونم که به یاد جورج ساخته شده.
Now, a child in Afghanistan going to one of these schools, let's say the name of a victim was George, and the school was called George. That little Afghan boy or girl would say to himself or herself every day going to the school, oh, I'm going to a school which is built in the name of a victim of 9/11.
بعد تا الان خیلی از این تروریست از میزان تروریست‌ها کم شده بود.
As a result, I assure you the number of the terrorists would have lessened considerably by now.
هر تروریستی رو که میکشید بچه‌هاش تفنگ رو برمی‌دارن و اونا می‌جنگن.
Every terrorist that you kill, you can be sure that the child of the terrorist or the children of that terrorist will pick up arms and take their place.
بنابراین ما بایستی راه مبارزه با تروریسم رو عوض کنیم.
Therefore, we have to change the way we fight terrorism.
و این اولین قدم آموزشه.
And the first step to that end is education.
و اما چه آموزشی؟
And now, what kind of education?
آموزش با کیفیت ولی هم با توجه به موقعیت مکانی.
Yes, an education based on quality, but bearing in mind who this education is targeted at.
باید ببینیم که در اون کشوری که صحبتشو میکنیم چه نوع مسائلی بایستی آموزش بدیم که جهت فکری درستی به مردم بدیم.
We have to look at the country which we're targeting and see what issues need to be highlighted in in their educational system.
توی کشورهای اسلامی همه گروه های بنیادگرا یا حکومت های غیر دموکراتیک عنوان میکنن که حقوق بشر یک ارزش یک سیستم غربیه.
Now, in countries that are dominated by Islamic fundamentalists, they say that, oh, the human rights is something that has been propagated by the West and is based on Western values.
و کشورهای اسلامی آمدن یک اعلامیه اسلامی حقوق بشر درست کردن.
As a result, Islamic countries have come up with their own version of an Islamic declaration of human rights.
و هر وقت صحبت حقوق بشر بشه میگن ما پیرو اعلامیه اسلامی حقوق بشر هستیم.
So whenever anything about human rights is mooted, they say we only follow the Islamic declaration of human rights.
خب در مواجهه با این حرف بایستی استدلال کرد که اگر مسلمان ها به خاطر مذهب خودشون حق داشته باشن که یک اعلامیه اسلامی واسه خودشون بنویسن، این همین حق رو بایستی واسه سایر مذاهب هم قائل شد.
So based on that justification, we should say to these Muslims that if they can write their own Islamic declaration of rights, they should also give that right to people of other religions. They should all come up with their own individual declaration of human rights.
و فردا ما اعلامیه یهودی حقوق بشر داریم، اعلامیه هندویی حقوق بشر داریم.
And what's going to happen? Tomorrow we are going to have a declaration of human rights for the Hindus. We are going to have another one for the Jews, a Jewish declaration of human rights, a Hindu declaration of human rights, and so on and so forth.
و می‌بینیم که دیگه چیز یونیورسالی باقی نمیمونه و در این میان اونی که ضرر میکنه مسلمان ها هستند.
And soon we'll see there will be no such thing as a universal declaration of human rights. And who is going to suffer the greatest loss? It's going to be the Muslims themselves.
متاسفانه وقت کمه ولی کن آموزش با کیفیت کلید حل بسیاری از مشکلاته.
Unfortunately, I don't have any time here to talk about this, but again, I emphasize education based on quality is the key to resolving this situation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ebadi. And I'm going to turn to Bissy. The other part of that question was aimed in your direction of, you reminded us what Boko Haram means. So where does education sit in as a remedy to these issues in the situation that you're talking about?
Thank you very much. Education is still an antidote to the problems we have now. With Boko Haram is a recent phenomenon, so to say. And I'm able to say that way back in 2003, when we didn't have Boko Haram as such, the education of children was so highly valued in Nigeria, so much so that in those parts of the north where Boko Haram is now operating, we had an increase in the number of children that were being educated because of the massive awareness creation and all that. Because we noticed before that, because of the culture, most of them were not sending their children to school. But there was massive education, massive awareness creation, and the children were going to school. In fact, by 2003, in some parts of the country, we found out that the girls were more in school than the boys. For instance, in the eastern part, the boys were not going to school because their parents believed that the boys should start earning money early. So they sent them to be apprentices, in the cities to go and learn some trade or whatever. Whereas the girls were going to school. And we found out that the girls, so we had even more girls in school than we had boys. So with the coming of Boko Haram now, it has, retrogressed all those gains that we've had over those years. And I do not believe that Boko Haram is going to be a permanent thing. I know that with the new government, we're going to address the issue of Boko Haram squarely and ensure that we have defined borders. Because as it is, we don't even know who these Boko Haram people are. Are they really Nigerians? Or are they from Niger, Chad, or whatever? Because the borders are so porous that these people just move in and out. So we don't know whether they're coming from the Maghreb or somewhere, So when we get this new government, we're going to define the borders, and then it will be so clear, and then we can face our issues. Educating the populace that education is important, it will not be very difficult for us, when we don't have them, fearing some form of atrocities or the other.
Thanks, Bisi. And
oh, sorry. And I forgot to say, then it's also very important because one of the strategies that we used was that to make education free and compulsory up to a certain level. And it is in our constitution. So we will still operate that. If the education is free and is compulsory, the parents don't need to bother because they don't have money not to send their girls or not to send their boys to school. So with that, and that is still, entrenched in our constitution, that education will be free up to a particular level, then we can move on from there.
thank you. And then, Ms. Puri, the questions around 1325 from Human Rights Watch and the lack of success in terms of Afghanistan and 15th anniversary coming up, and then the post-2015 agenda, India, China, Brazil, and agenda approach.
Thank you. And if I may also address the question about ideologies, fathers, men, and this whole thing. But just very quickly,
Then we'd have another round of questions. Yep.
just very quickly, I want to say that when we are talking about the theology of patriarchy, it can be in every religion, because for thousands of years it has been fostered, this theology of patriarchy, and it has taken different forms and in different countries and continents. So to change that in men, I think we really need to have two counterpart global social movements. And one of them, of course, is the women's movement itself, to build the confidence that Shirin is talking about, self-awareness that we are equal and also of equal humanity, but also that we are able to change. Because often women give up and despair that there is no prospect of change. So that confidence, I think we need the women's movement to build, and that's what we are very much driving. Because it's one thing to have laws and policies and the superstructure of change, but the real grassroots, ground up change comes from social movement. So that's one that we have in the campaigns and the advocacy around that. But also the other is the men's movement of solidarity, of self-awareness, equal self-awareness, that this is not right, it is not just, but also that it's not good for anyone. And that it's a factor for empowering everyone, including men. So we have the he for she movement, as you know, which has been very successful. And exactly, first of all, and there is a whole men's movement, men for gender justice movement around the world. We, in fact, last year had a major event in Delhi on men and boys for gender justice. So this is something that is really to be built forward. There are the enlightened fathers who are doing it, or sons who have seen their mothers being abused by their fathers and wanting to change. I mean, there is a whole spectrum of men who are out there. So I think we have to tap all that. They referring to 1325 and what's October 25 going to be about, the 15th anniversary of 1325. There are two processes, as you know. One is they are of course interrelated. This whole global review of the implementation of 1325 was triggered by Resolution 2122 of the UN Security Council, which recognized very much what you're saying, that it is not being implemented. 15 years after it has been adopted, on the ground it has not been implemented. And you're right about Afghanistan. We advocated with all concerned, and all those big powers who were there, we advocated to have women. We have been supporting all of you and women's movement in Afghanistan to be out there, and peace negotiators to be there. So everywhere, whether it is in peacemaking or in peace building and in transitional justice systems, in transitional political systems, it is not happening enough. So that's why this review will tell us, and global study which is being conducted, and we are the UN Women is the secretariat for that. It has now progressed considerably. In fact, this month is a very intense period where we are looking at all the results coming in from the ground, all the case studies. And then we lead up to a point where we will bring to the international community what is the reality on the ground. Why is it not working? What are the gaps? What needs to be done? And one of the things that we are very much emphasizing is hoping that October 25 will bring the reality to the fore in stark terms, that it will then bring forward also the political commitment of the countries that are themselves rebuilding or in post-conflict situation or conflict situation, but also commitment of the Security Council members, the donors, and others who have, national action plans, but as well as very important resource commitments. This is really critical, and we are very much hoping that there will be a funding of women's movements, of women who can then be active participants in all of these peace processes, because this is one of the areas which is also lacking. India, China, Brazil, I just want to quickly refer to the question about their role in the, yes, indeed, India, China, Brazil, the whole G77, UN Women has, Shirin has referred to this whole issue of gender equality and women's empowerment and human rights agenda overall, but women's rights agenda as well, being seen in some quarters as a Western imposition, as a kind of missionary or proselytization of the developing world. But I think increasingly, and that's again part of the good news, is that large parts of the world now own that agenda and have become advocates. And UN Women's mission has been, since its inception, to get the developing countries, the G77, to own this agenda. And one of our greatest successes was to get, first of all, the G77 for the first time in 50 years, last year in its summit, adopted gender equality and women's empowerment as a key priority. and this was a first. And then became also a champion for a standalone goal on on achieving gender equality and women's empowerment for all women and girls in the Sustainable Development Goals and post-2015 Development Agenda. And now in the financing for development negotiations too, we are very much getting them, as well as even the LDCs and others, to be champions of a transformative financing of gender equality commitments and their implementation.
Thank you. And now let's get another round of questions. So if I could see some more hands. The woman at the very back over there, and then the woman over here. In the front here, so that's three. Have a look.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for your enlightening papers. We've heard that women's groups need to be in the centre.
Sorry, could you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, Anita Williams, independent consultant. We've heard that women's groups need to be in the centre of gender equality and gender justice. This question is to Ms. Bisi and to Nicola. You both, the context of Nigeria and Ethiopia, very interesting. You have a judicial system that recognizes both civil law and Sharia law. You have a social system that doesn't protect women and children, and you have, you have both cultural and religious views that kind of come into every debate. So, what have women's groups in the research that you've done? What are the lessons learned from the social movement of women's groups? Thank you.
Thank you. Over here.
Hi. My name's Isabel. I work for Women Living Under Muslim Laws. My question really is to do with a bit of a tension that I'm seeing coming up. I think in everyone's presentations, it's kind of been very clear that there are really big structural issues at play that are leading to the real injustices that women are facing in their everyday lives. So, for example, in Nigeria, you raised the point about corruption, how government spends, also poverty in relation to the problems of extremism and fragility. And in the example from Nicola, it's obvious that the injustices faced by, for example, maids are to do with global economic injustices. Otherwise, these women wouldn't even be going to the Gulf to work. And countries like Saudi Arabia would be held accountable if they weren't in the position that they are. So how do we balance, as people who are invested in women's rights globally, how do we balance the need for education and all these really needed cultural interventions of changing religious interpretations with a need for this really macro picture? Where do we focus our efforts?
Very good, very good. Front here. And then there was a gentleman over here, I think, who had his hand up. Yes, and that would be our fourth.
So my question's for Bisi. I'm Ishbel from the ODI. I just really wanted to know, Bring Back Our Girls was a huge global campaign. Like Shimi's talked about the need to campaign and mobilisation. What impact did you think that campaign actually had in Nigeria itself? Because unfortunately, as we know, it didn't bring back our girls. But I just wondered what other impacts you thought it had.
Lovely, thank you. And then our last question for this round.
Thank you. I'm David Walker. I'm ODI as well, I'm afraid. We've been hearing a lot about...
I didn't know, honestly. So.
Yeah, sorry. We've been hearing a lot about rights today, but very little about responsibilities and the kind of corresponding nature of those responsibilities. And I find that when you get down to household level and you speak to people that experience these injustices, that they wave away this whole rights agenda as something that's been imposed upon them. So somebody who, for instance, would have a girl that's chosen to get married, and you speak to the parents, they say, well, it was my daughter's decision, I don't have any role in it, she's got her own rights. I feel that the whole kind of rights agenda somehow seems to be misapplied at the local level, and what can we do to kind of promote this whole responsibilities agenda that seems to have been lacking so far?
Okay, thank you. So, Bisi, would you like to go first on this?
Yes. Thank you. Yes, in Nigeria we have this dual system of laws that at least in the northern parts mostly, we don't have the Sharia in the southern parts. And I believe that the inclusion of the Sharia legal system in the country in 1999 has been the one to actually being the foundation for the springing up of all these Islamic fundamentalists, because initially, Nigeria is a multi-religious country. Everybody practices their own religion. We have Islamic religion, we have a Christian religion, we have traditional practitioners. In fact, we don't know that whether the traditional practitioners are more than the two popular religions. But then, in 1999, when one state, Zamfara, started agitating to have Sharia, the Sharia law was limited to civil action and not to criminal action. But then they started with trying to criminalize women that they believe had committed adultery, and they wanted to stone. The women started the movement, against that no woman should be stoned to death. In the first instance, it's against our constitution, which is against torture in human treatment. Secondly, that it takes two to tango. When two people commit adultery, why will you fish out the woman and not the man? So it's either both of them are stoned to death or nobody. But invariably, it's only the women that are convicted and are supposed to do. We fought that fight for a long time. And at the end of the day, the Supreme Court had to pass a decision that they're not supposed to deal with criminal actions, because all crimes must be written in our laws under our criminal code or penal code in the northern parts. So that's how we overcame that. So in spite of the fact that we have Sharia law, if they had limited the scope to only the civil action, their divorce and all that, it's okay. But with the Sharia law, we had all these fundamentalists coming in, and which has also disrupted the issue. But the movement of the women, I would say that for some time now at the global setting, the recognition of the role that NGOs play has been really pronounced, because governments have found that it's not possible for state governments alone to do all this, that they need the support of the NGOs and civil societies that are, closer to the grassroots to be able to effect some of the laudable decisions that they make at the international level. And as such, the rise of the women's movement and so many movements have been able to assist our governments in implementing some of their commitments at the international level or regional level. With the Nigerian setup, we have a lot of women's movement, I would say. It's not a heterogeneous. We have movements for so many issues, different issues. We have coalition, you have networks, and we have been able to move on with that. And I recall that in 1993, 94, towards the Beijing conference in 1995, it was the women in Africa that brought on board the issue of the girl child. It was not one of the critical areas of concern, but the African women insisted that we wanted it as a matter of concern, because it was a critical area of concern, because we are the one facing the issue of traditional practices against children, like the female genital mutilation. We were facing these child marriages. We were facing all kinds of sexual exploitation, trafficking of children. So we brought it on board. So the women movements have been really very effective, in terms of assisting government to meet their commitment, and also plowing back into the society to ensure that we have development all round. Then somebody was asking that, okay, we've mentioned Nigeria, corruption, poverty, and which one should we choose? I think we need a multifaceted approach. We cannot leave one for the other. We have to address the issue of poverty. It's very important, because for as long as we have inequality between the North and the South, we will continually have this problem. Is the issue of poverty that has given birth to all these migration problems that we're having now? Is the issue of poverty that has made women vulnerable, and as such they are now victims of trafficking and all kinds of atrocities? So we need to look at them from the different angles. And then the issue of corruption, that is specific to individual countries has to be addressed, because where a country has the resources to do perform certain social services and it's not able to do it because of the corruption, that has to be addressed headlong first. And I believe that the new government is going to address the issue of corruption headlong because it's very important. Then the last question was, what is the impact of the Bring Back Our Girls? First of all, the Bring Back Our Girls has been able to put the issue of these Chibok girls, first of all, on global arena. It's now on global platform. People are now, all over the world. In our own organization, our own Individual Women Consortium of Nigeria, at the onset, when we noticed that it looked like the government did not have the political will to address Boko Haram headlong, we decided to take the matter internationally. So we had to write to all the human rights missions in Geneva. And then we also wrote to IOC, writing petitions to them that they should come and help us. And then to ECOWAS too, that look, Nigeria has been able to help countries like Liberia, Sierra Leone in fighting their wars because our soldiers were considered the best in the ECOMOG. Why now do we have a problem and then nobody's addressing it? Because I knew that the government was not going to do anything. So we wrote to those ones. And the responses that we had actually also brought it to the human rights community. The IOC had to reply to say, look, this thing is not Islamic. Because we had to ask them, because the people who are being killed, who are being adopted, are both Christians and Muslims. When they were abducting the girls, they didn't ask, are you a Christian or are you a Muslim? They abducted everybody. When they are killing the people, they didn't ask who whether you were Christians or Muslims. They were abducted. So it's no longer an Islamic thing. And in any case, education is not against the Islamic law. Education is even propagated by the Quran. So we had to address that. So that's one of the things that, they Bring Back Our Girls has done. And then they Bring Back Our Girls locally. There is a group of the Bring Back Our Girls that every day they sit somewhere in the square in Abuja. And this has, given more awareness to this issue, and it has also mobilized more people to join, both men and women. We have gender advocates who are male, who have joined in the struggle for Bring Back Our Girls. And then for us, in all the states, in most of the states, we have every Saturday, they have a protest and they discuss this issue. And apart from that, the Bring Back Our Girls locally have gone to the strategic ministries and officials involved. They have been to the president, they have been to the National Assembly, to the Senate president, to the leadership of the House of Representatives, the Speaker. They have been to the Ministry of Defense to, put up protests and say this is this one. And at each time, they were always asking for the progress of the government in addressing the issue of bringing our girls. Because for a long time, our government did not believe that those girls were missing. That was the initial obstacle. Because the government did not believe they were missing. They thought it was a political gimmick. And none of them, no journalist, went to Chibok for about a month from our country. It took a CNN journalist from the US to encourage our own journalists to go there. So there was nobody hearing, so we were just hearing hearsay. So, okay, my brother is involved, or my sister is involved. So we had to do that to continue that momentum in order to ensure that the government is put at its toes. So it has had a lot of impact, not only our government, and at the international level as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And Nicola, can I turn to you now?
Sure, thank you. Just to pick up on the question again about what role have women's groups been playing in the Ethiopian context. Up until the NGO registration law of 2009-2010, they were very active and particularly spearheaded by the very famous Ethiopian Women Lawyers Association. But since the NGO law came in, it's been much more difficult to do work around gender and around rights. So women's groups have had to become more creative in their approach. And I think one really nice example is work that's being coordinated by Norwegian Church Aid and Save the Children. They're working with a whole consortium of local women's groups, but are working to convince religious and traditional leaders the importance of changing harmful traditional practices. And where they've been particularly successful is around convincing the heads of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the heads of various Protestant denominations, the Catholic Church. They're still working on the Muslim Development Agency to come out with proclamations justified by their own religious text against female genital mutilation and cutting, and that's had a very profound impact. And I think that's somewhere where people working on child marriage could be looking, is to work directly with religious leaders at the highest level. It's taken quite a lot of time, but I think it's beginning to show dividends. The issue about sort of potential tensions between focusing on cultural change and then the broader structural issues. I mean, I think in the case of Ethiopia, it's very clear that because the remittances are so high and have increased so dramatically, Ethiopia now has the 10th largest remittances globally, but they've just come into the top 10 over the last decade. That this is not something that can be stopped. And I don't think we want to be stopping girls from migrating, but much has to be done ensuring that it's much safer. I think one of the things that we've been trying to do with our local counterparts in Addis Ababa is to look to the examples of the Philippines, who have been much more successful in protecting their women and girls about potential abuses. There's many more safety nets involved. There's in the psychosocial support on return. So there are some good practice examples. At the moment, because the Ethiopian government is turning a blind eye, they're really, in many ways, allowing these terrible abuses to be perpetuated. So I think there's ways to make economic empowerment safe and to protect against that gender injustice.
Thank you, thank you. And I now, perhaps...
I'd like to say something about the child marriage.
Yep, yes, very quickly.
Because somebody asked the question about if the girl decides that she wants to, that she has the right to marry, that then the parents would say, okay, they have no choice but to allow that child to marry. I think you need to look at it from the preview that that girl must have been socialized to believe that marriage is the best thing. And what we try to do, that's why education is very important for them to start from the low level when they're in school. And I recall that when we came back from Beijing in 1995, we wanted to take Beijing to the nooks and crannies of Nigeria. So we went to a village called Birnin Kebbi, where the people were Fulani headsmen, and they didn't even understand Hausa language, let alone understand English. We had to get interpreters to meet with the women. When we met with the women, and I told one of them, I said, look, I told the women, I said, I'm a lawyer, and this is what I do. I said, oh, you're a lawyer? Oh, they would like their girls to be like me, that they like the way I was talking. I said, okay, fine. If you want to do that, you need to send your children to school. Oh, they said, then they will do that. I said, well, how do you do that? If your husband says you can't send your child to school, you say, if he says I can't send my child to school, then I will take my cattle and leave. I said, oh, are you the owner of the cattle? That was when I realized that the cattle actually belongs to the women. It was their dowry, not the men. And that economic power is with the women, not with the men. But we didn't know that. So with that education, you have to go to the crannies and localize it and tell them this is the situation. And when they look at role models, they want to also be ministers, because some of their northern women are ministers. They want to be like them, so they would send their girls to school.
Thank you very much. Ms. Puri, just 1 minute, and then I'm going to turn to Dr. Ebadi as our keynote speaker to wrap up for us with some final comments.
I wanted to very quickly say that big structural issues must be addressed, like in the Beijing platform. Big structural issues like poverty, the economy, peace and security, environment, all of those are very, very germane to the whole gender equality and women's empowerment mission. That's why we cannot talk about or deal with or address these underlying structural issues unless we address gender equality and women's empowerment. So they have to be together. It's not a separation. The second thing I want to very quickly say is that there are 3 levels of how to change the theology in Islam, but there are in other traditional practices, even in the indigenous communities in Latin America. One is, of course, the traditional laws and traditional norm reform itself. For example, in Indonesia, the family code, and in Morocco, there is a family code change itself, even the civil law. The second is to change the national law and make it prevail over some of these, parallel legal systems and justice systems, and to make that prevail and to make that based on universal human rights and women's rights standards. And the third is to have a very vibrant religious reform dialogue, like the Musawa. We are doing a lot of work in many countries, Islamic countries, on this kind of reinterpretation of the Sharia. As Shirin said, nothing is actually discriminatory in its origin, but it's the interpretation that has made it so. So I think all these need to be done together. Thank you.
Dr. Ebadi.
خیلی راحت تره که ما جلوی آتش سوزی رو بگیریم تا بخوایم آتش رو خاموش کنیم.
As I said, it's easier to prevent building from going on fire than trying to extinguish that fire once it's happened.
پناهندگانی که توی دریا غرق شدن و اکثرا هم از لیبی میان، میخوام اشاره کنم به اون وضعیت.
I would like to highlight the plight of the refugees who drowned in the Mediterranean, most of them coming from Libya.
وضعیت اینا انقدر ناگواره که حتی اتحادیه اروپا یه تصمیماتی در مورد کمک به اینها گرفته.
The predicament is so dire that even the European Union has adopted some measures to help them.
و بعضی ها هم صحبت میکنن که با قاچاقچیان انسان در لیبی بایستی جنگید و راه حل نظامی ارائه میدن.
And there are some who believe that the only way to confront human trafficking is through military intervention.
خب همه ما میدونیم که لیبی چه وضعیت ناگواری داره و مردم مجبورن که از اونجا فرار کنن.
Now we are all aware of the terrible situation in Libya and how people have no choice but to flee Libya.
و الان اروپا در مقابل یک چالش بزرگ قرار گرفته که با این پناهندگان چه بکنه.
And that has presented Europe with a huge challenge, what to do with these refugees.
و من میخوام شما رو به 15 سال قبل برگردونم.
Now I want to take you back to 15 years ago.
زمانی که قذافی در قدرت بود.
When Gaddafi was in power.
و نقض حقوق بشر داشت و مردم رو میکشت.
And human rights violations were rife and he was killing his own people.
و کارپشن خیلی زیادی داشت.
And there was extreme corruption.
پولای قذافی کجا بود؟
Now, where were Gaddafi's income and money?
توی بانک‌های اروپا بود.
He had put his money in European banks.
پولای کثیف رو قبول کردید.
In other words, European banks, you had accepted the dirty money.
و دیکتاتورهای آلوده به کارپشن رو بدین صورت تشویق کردید به ادامه کارپشن.
In other words, you've been encouraging dictators who've been tainted with corruption to continue their corruption.
بنابراین اگر پولهای کثیف قبول نشن کارپشن کم میشه.
So if you do not accept dirty money, that would lessen corruption.
قذافی وقتی که می آمد اروپا و مخصوصا من به خاطرم هست که در روم که رفته بود برای تحقیر اروپایی‌ها گفته بود من قصری که برای اقامتم در نظر گرفتن قبول ندارم. رفت توی پارکی چادر زد گفت من به شکل قبیله خودم میخوام زندگی کنم.
I remember myself how when Gaddafi was visiting in Europe, particularly in Rome, this incident, I haven't forgotten that to humiliate the Italian government, he said, oh, I don't want this mansion that you've chosen for me to stay in. And he went and camped in a park.
و ایتالیا قبولش کرد برای اینکه میخواست باش قرارداد نفتی خیلی خوبی ببنده.
Italy accepted that. Why? Because they were thinking of the lucrative oil deal they were going to sign with him.
و قذافی با نخوت بیشتری به کشورش برگشت و بیشتر آدم کشت.
So Gaddafi returned to his country with even more corrupt and killed even more people.
و اگر شما انقدر به قذافی کمک نمی‌کردید الان با این وضع مواجه نبودید.
Now, had you not helped Gaddafi on such a scale, the situation today would not have risen.
که مردم به خاطر فرار از اون وضعیت بیان تو دریا غرق بشن و حتی شما الان ندونید چیکارش باید بکنید.
So these people, to flee that predicament, they are risking their lives and with the possibility of drowning in the sea, and you don't know what to do with them.
ما همه سوار بر یک کشتی هستیم.
We are all in the same boat.
اجازه ندیم که جایی از این کشتی آتش بگیره.
Do not allow any part of this boat to go on fire.
وقتی که شما چشمتون رو بر روی یک حکومت دیکتاتوری میبندید در حقیقت اجازه میدید که آتش شروع بشه.
When you closed your eyes to a dictatorial government, in other words, you are actually letting this fire to start.
وقتی که بانک‌های شما پول‌های کثیف ناشی از کارابشن رو قبول میکنن در حقیقت اجازه میدن که آتش شروع بشه.
When your banks accept this dirty money that emanates from corruption, you are allowing the flames of this fire to start.
ما همه سوار بر یک کشتی هستیم.
Again, we are all in the same boat.
امنیت شما امنیت ما هم هست.
Your security is also our security.
ما همه در یک سمتیم.
We are all going in one direction.
فقط بایستی سعی کنیم که به امروزمون فکر نکنیم، فکر فرداهامون هم باشیم.
We shouldn't just think about today, we should think about tomorrow.
در اون صورته که فردا برای ما زیباتر خواهد شد.
That is the only way tomorrow would be more beautiful for us. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Thank you to all of our speakers here today. Thank you as the audience. I think that it has been a good discussion. I think that Dr. Ebadi has issued us with quite a challenge there as we conclude today. I think the challenge is a really deep one as we see, if I pick up just that Mediterranean issue for a moment, as we see search and rescue potentially becoming search and bomb to stop boats leaving Libya. So those are still the reactions that we get from the UK and European partners and the international community generally. So that challenge to us to think longer term is one that we at Amnesty take to governments around the world all the time. I know that from the development perspective, the issues that you and others are working on in terms of 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals that we from the human rights world are interested in too, that we will have all taken away lots of ideas in terms of discussion about priorities there. 1325 and the 15th anniversary, I think, is another moment where we can think about how we can push forward some of these issues, how we can support women's role in peace and in security. So my thanks to all of you. I think that I will be left thinking too about Dr. Ebadi's words about the non-acceptance of gender equality. And I think for me, that phrase, what did Eve do, will go into my discussions about these issues for the future. So thank you very much. And my thanks to Dr. Ebadi and to Maria Musavi for her great interpreting. Thank you to you, to ODI staff for all your organising and hosting. Please look out for the next Global Challenges series. Please stay on for lunch. And if I can just hand Kevin for the last words.
Thank you, and I'm certainly not planning to stand between you guys and lunch, so I'll be really brief. But just to say a huge thank you, Kate, to you as well for chairing it so proficiently. Actually, it's been a real privilege to be at this event, and listening to Shirin is, it's sort of like being in the presence of a composite of Mary Wollstonecraft, Tom Paine, and Montesquieu. I apologise for the slight gender bias in the, but I think it's an incredibly powerful reminder of the force and the meaning of universal rights. And, the rights that are enshrined in the United Nations system, in civil rights legislation around the world. But I think, for me, the other thing that has come out really powerfully from today, that the transition from rights to enactment of the rights is so important. And I think this gets us into the terrain that Nicola focused on, which is attitudes and norms, and the position of girls like Kiros and Salila that you very powerfully put up. And I think this is about changing power relationships, actually, and I think that is what we've seen from Nigeria and from Shirin's discussion. And the gap between the spirit of the law, as you described it, and the reality of people's lives, which you see in Baltimore, you see in Rotherham, you see in Nigeria, you see in India, is what we have to close. And in that context, I guess the big question, I think, for all of us in the development community is how do we hold governments to account for acting on their responsibilities to their citizens? I think it's a big challenge. And my worry, not to want to end on a downbeat note, and to use the ghastly word, is how do we mainstream this type of perspective? Because I'm struck by the fact there are very few men in this audience. I promise you, if we had a debate on economic growth, this would be a room full of men, with some women as well. Similarly, if we had a discussion on education, I think there'd be a lot of men here. But the problems that we've been discussing, do more to hold back economic growth, to undermine education systems, and to destroy opportunities, than almost anything else I can think of. But but somehow we haven't made this a sort of universal development issue, and we need to tackle that maybe through the post-2015 agenda and other opportunities. So a huge thank you to all of the panelists and to everybody here. As I said, Nicola and Caroline are going to be available over lunch. There are a lot of their publications out here, which I'd really encourage you to seize the opportunity for grabbing a copy now. And Kate, again, thanks very much to you.